Today I want to talk about feminism. Feminism is about changing norms, social norms, legal norms. If we take a look at the 60s and the 70s, we see norms being changed. We see gender inequalities being addressed and battled. But the 60s and the 70s aren't the birthplace or the birth time for feminism. 60s and the 70s are merely a time period in which feminism is being expressed. So if we want to take a look at the source of feminism, we have to go farther back. Some authors posit that feminism has a techno-social source, that feminism arose as a response to two technologies, coffee houses and condoms. With the rise in coffee houses, you have the rise in prostitution. With the rise in the production and distribution of condoms, you have the rise in promiscuity. You have the rise in fearlessness. People are no longer afraid of things like syphilis. So early feminists were concerned with pragmatic social change. They were concerned with things like banning prostitution, raising the legal age. But this still doesn't seem to be the source of feminism. The reason why, the values of feminism are something that have been around longer than these techno-social sources. So let's take a look at the values of feminism as they're expressed in the feminist tradition. First, there's equal theory feminism. Equal theory feminism has two features. The first one is that women and men ought to be treated equally. And the second one is, the law should not be based on generalizations, even statistically or scientifically accurate ones. So when we take a look at things like financial impact, military rights and benefits, recklessness and drunk driving, males and females should be treated the same way. So the moral norms, the legal norms should be the same. But cultural feminists come around and they say there's a problem with this similarly situated characterization of things. The male experience is the reference point of equality. So when you're talking about males and females being similarly situated, you're talking primarily about the male point of reference. So cultural feminists have two different points. First, the legal system only considers the male norm, and laws should accommodate the biological and cultural differences between men and women. So, when you take a look at ethical theory, you have the male-dominated tradition, utility, justice, punishment. And when you go beyond good and evil, when you go beyond classical ethical theory, and you find yourself in strange territory like Nietzsche's territory, you still have a male-dominated point of view, the overman. Cultural feminists think that the male-dominated ethical tradition isn't the whole story. We need an ethics of care. Specifically, we need to account for ethical parameters like empathy. And we've talked about this before. When we take a look at the physiological effects of oxytocin, oxytocin is causally linked to empathy. There might be a new moral dimension offered by this physiological result. This is not a parameter that male-dominated ethical theories usually focus on, but it might be something very important, and it might be something that we should distinguish from the male tradition. There are two criticisms. One is that this view is anecdotally supported. Now, as we see from the previous slide, a lot of people have actually done work on oxytocin and testosterone, that oxytocin is causally linked to empathy and testosterone is causally linked to not only selfishness, but also punishing other selfish individuals. So this criticism might not stand. The second one's a little bit stronger. This view focuses on the reinforcement of stereotypes. So we don't want to characterize women as needing special protection. So we might have to move away from this view. Next, we have the dominance theory. The goal of dominance theory feminism is the liberation of females from males. Now, here's a good characterization. Under the sameness standard, women are measured according to our correspondence with man. Our equality judged by proximity to his measure. So when we're talking about equality, we're talking about the male point of reference. While under the difference standard, we are measured according to our lack of correspondence to him. So we're still talking about the male point of reference even when we're talking about the distance from males. Dominance theory feminism says we need to liberate ourselves After dominance theory, feminist theories become a little bit more complex. They posit that females don't have a common experience. There's no homogeneous experience. What I want to do next is I want to address the male perspective in society. I want to ask, is there a male perspective dominated society? This seems pretty clear in things like advertisement, but is it also clear in areas like politics, religion, education, employment, science? But here's an area where you might not think you'd find the male dominated perspective. This is an interesting characterization that someone made of all the female characters in Disney movies. The argument is supposed to be that all of these characters are one-dimensional, that their only value is some sort of sexual value. I'm not sure if it's true, but what's important is that we extend feminism and what feminists are trying to do beyond just advertisement, beyond just clear examples of a male-dominated perspective. And it's also important is that males can also be feminists. Males can also appreciate feminist values. So let's see if we can extend feminism into an interesting example in education and science. What's wrong with education? So the way that I'd like for you to think about this is a really simple question. Why do males hate asking for directions? Most people will say it's because males are egotistical. It's because they're very confident. Why is that? It's because males think they're really good at spatial reasoning. And some females might think this also, but in society, for some reason, we have this perspective that males are better at spatial reasoning than females. And this is supported by numbers, and more numbers, and more numbers. Turns out these numbers aren't accurate. But in the 80s and 90s, people were very concerned with these numbers. People were very concerned with this research. In fact, not only social psychologists, but also evolutionary biologists. These people were asking questions like, what is the evolutionary reason for spatial reasoning differences between the sexes? Hint, it has to do something with the lifestyle of people, with the early lifestyle. So let's take a look back at our ancestors. Evolutionary biologists posit that there is a link between promiscuity and spatial reasoning. And the way that this is supposed to work is promiscuity is somehow supposed to increase the function and the size of the hippocampus. Now there's a complex causal connection. First, what you have is promiscuity increases testosterone. You also see a causal connection between testosterone and hippocampus development. If you inject organisms with testosterone early enough, the hippocampus will develop to a larger size. And there's a connection between hippocampus development and spatial reasoning. So biologists think that there is this complex causal connection between promiscuity and spatial reasoning. This means that non-promiscuous behavior should give rise to poor spatial reasoning. Now, to consider how stupid this is, just think about it this way. If you want to get good scores on your LSAT, your GRE, your GMAT tests, what should you do? Should you change your promiscuous or non-promiscuous behavior? No, that's not going to do anything. When scientists want to corroborate a hypothesis about humans, they don't study humans. They study organisms like this, the cuddly monogamous prairie vole. Now, what's interesting about the male and female prairie vole is they'll stay together for life. And how do you know they're truly monogamous? Well, you isolate them. You put the male and female in different rooms. And you introduce a tempting prairie vole. So when you introduce the male to a tempting female prairie vole, he will stay away from her, he'll go in the corner, and in some cases he'll even attack her. Next, you have a different kind of vole, the montane vole. And this one, to put it in simple terms, is just very promiscuous. So scientists posit that the monogamous prairie voles should have the same spatial reasoning. The male and female should have the same abilities and same hippocampus size. And in fact, this is true. Males and females have the same spatial reasoning abilities. But in the montane vole, because the male is promiscuous, you should see an increase in spatial reasoning abilities in the male, but not in the female. And also larger hippocampus in the male, but not in the female. This is in fact also true. So this seems to corroborate the hypothesis that spatial reasoning is somehow directly causally linked to promiscuity. But we have a problem. You remember this right here? There's a correlation between crime and ice cream. So as ice cream sales go up, so does crime. Does this mean that ice cream is somehow causally behind crime? No. Turns out that both are caused by heat. Ice cream consumption is very clearly caused by heat. Crime, not so clearly. For some reason, when it gets hot outside, people get a little bit crazy. But what's important to note here is that just because ice cream sales and crime are correlated doesn't mean that they're causally related. It could be a third factor that is causally producing an increase in both. We see the same thing in this study with the voles. You have a hidden element that's not expressed, the environment. Turns out that just because promiscuity is correlated with spatial reasoning doesn't mean that a rise in promiscuity or promiscuous behavior is causally related to spatial reasoning. Turns out both are caused by the environment and the social role. The prairie vole has a very simple environment. Males and females have common roles, but not the montane vole. The montane vole has a more complex environment, and the male is in charge of gathering food, which requires more navigation in the environment. So here what we see is that the environment plus social role, that's really the causal factor behind promiscuity and spatial reasoning. What we see is a bias in science. We see a premature explanation, and it's wrong. Feminists are not only pointing out these biases in science, they're also pointing out these biases when it comes to social sexual norms. So what are feminists doing in the realm of social sexual norms? Let's take a step back. Feminists are getting at the reality behind the appearance. We're going to finish up with one example of this. Pornography. Is there a truth behind pornography, or is it just a matter of perspective? If it's just a matter of perspective, then different parties will have different appearances. For some, pornography will be liberation, and for others, subservience. But feminists want to go beyond appearances. They want to say that subservience is one reality behind pornography, and there are others. Objectification, treating people as objects, dehumanizing people, degrading people. There's actual physical harm involved. Inaccuracy, we are teaching people inaccurate intimacy norms. Offense. Determination. You might think that people participating in pornography have a choice, but sometimes they are coerced with violence and drugs. And finally, discrimination. With pornography, we are violating the right to equality. We're going to spend some time on these, and we're also going to look at some more examples of how feminism uncovers the reality behind the appearance. Then, we're going to look at how feminism can use these realities to restructure our social sexual norms. So to summarize, what we've done is taken a look at feminist perspectives. We've discussed how these perspectives point out bias in science. Finally, we discuss how we can use these perspectives to get to the reality behind appearances. For example, the reality behind pornography.